Hey everybody! So we are in week 16, which is our second to last week of the semester. And this week we are finishing up our discussion of Parable of the Sower. Hopefully you finished reading that, or you'll be finishing it this week. This week also you need to complete the rough draft for your last essay. So you can take a look at the syllabus, and if you have any questions about any of the revised due dates that I've made, please let me know. But again, for this week, you need to work on writing your rough draft for the final essay. So I have a little bit more information to talk about as we discuss the conclusion of Parable of the Sower. And mainly what I'd like you to think about are the ways that Butler's future vision is grounded in past and present realities. So some historical examples of this include U.S. slavery, the systematic raping of women within U.S. slavery, Native American children stolen from their homes, forcibly adopted and re-educated, the movement from south to north of people fleeing poverty and political repression, the vast gap between rich and poor, gated communities, racist and corrupt police, sex trafficking and enslavement of women and children, and anti-immigration sentiment and legislation. So about these historical examples, and of course there are others, these are just some that I thought of after rereading Parable of the Sower. Please try to correspond Lauren's world in Parable of the Sower with these examples that I just mentioned. And then also think about how these examples are relatable today, and any other contemporary examples that are significant to the themes that are present in this novel. So really just tying all of these ideas together, past and present, and in the context of how these themes apply to the characters within the novel, and then how they apply to our lives today. And for the remainder of this lesson, for lack of a better word, I included some short excerpts from academic journals. I found all of these in JSTOR. So if you have access to JSTOR, you can look. There are others that I didn't include, but I did include links. So I downloaded the PDF format of each article, and then I have a link to the PDF format. The first article that I mentioned is Migration and Capital of the Body in Parable of the Sower. This article is solely about Parable of the Sower. I found it the most accessible out of the articles. It's relatively short. So if you don't read any of the other articles in their entirety, I suggest that this is the one that you do read. This is the one that you start with. It has overall good information about the book that hopefully will be helpful to you regardless of the topic you choose to write about for Parable of the Sower. So this, just in a nutshell, this article looks at migration, and the historian John Franklin talks about migration as a result of economic adjustment, whether due to World War, the end of the Civil War, or the desire to explore a Western frontier. Migration happens because a group of people want and need to make an economic adjustment in order to survive within a particular boundary. So in that context, he then looks at African Americans from a historical text, from slavery to freedom. That's his text. But his assertions do hold true across racial, class, and national boundaries. So then he talks about moving one's body voluntarily in hopes of relocating it in a better economic situation or environment is, a concept that goes back to nomadic cultures. But it's also a concept that speaks to how we mark our bodies in economic social systems as capital. And this is an important theme in Parable of the Sower. So this idea is explored throughout the rest of this article. He talks about body as capital as a notion that's been inextricably tied to the past and to the land of every marginalized people recorded in history. And he also says that any discussion of American slavery will undoubtedly reveal relationships between migration and cultivation of land and bodies as capital. But also, he specifically then hones in on Parable of the Sower to look at the complexity of such a relationship as it's engaged in a way that necessitates a reconfiguration of the notions of body, boundary, and capital. So throughout the rest of the article, he talks about this idea of how, specifically in Parable of the Sower, there is a reconfiguration of notions of body, boundary, and capital. The next excerpt is actually a chapter from a book. The book is called Black Movements, Performance in Cultural Politics. And the chapter is Prophesizing in Octavia Butler's Parable Series. And again, I just have a piece of this article, and I included a piece that talks about a little more about the biblical aspect of the parable of the sower. But also in this chapter, the author talks about rather than following the prophet Martin Luther King Jr., Lauren is more aligned with Harriet Tubman. So in this context, the author is looking at the costs women face when they imagine futures that don't replicate pre-existing social structures, including historical ones. And the connection to the women prophets emphasizes how Black movements intervene in the curtailment of the Civil Rights Project, which singularizes and masculinizes the prophet in the figure of King. But then after that, the author does talk more about, like I mentioned, the Parable of the Sower. And actually, the Parable of the Sower is told in the Gospels of Matthew, Mark, and Luke. And the biblical version establishes that, like a seed in the ground, a listener's ability to absorb a message requires suitable conditions. Used to empower, embolden, energize, and chastise, the parable situates belief at the core of worthwhile human endeavors. In the Gospels, Jesus describes a man who sows his seed on different types of terrain. So this example here, the different types of terrain. So some that fell by the wayside and the birds came and devoured them. Some that fell in stony places where there wasn't a lot of earth, so they couldn't really grow. And then forthwith they sprung up because they had no deepness of earth. And the sun was up. They were scorched because they had no root, and they withered away. This is all very metaphorical and not just literal. And then some falling among thorns and being choked out by the thorns. But then, and this is the key part, others that fell into good ground and brought forth fruit, some 100-fold, some 60-fold, some 30-fold. And a little bit more about this idea. The seed in Matthew 13:19 is the word of God, and the terrain is the individual as receptacle of belief. The word, as the seed symbolizes, is uniform, indistinguishable, and constant, with the potential to flourish and grow 100-fold. The variance is the terrain, the receptacle, and the individual receiver of the word. The parable of the sower demonstrates how the operation of the belief informs an individual's ability to use the prophetic, which is the predictive function of critical intelligence. And so I found this really interesting, and it goes on in more detail, which you can read if you are so inclined. And the next article is the intuition of the future, utopia, and catastrophe in Parable of the Sower. This article discusses the two classic pathways to modern utopia. First is the bureaucratic rationality to socioeconomic problems through the agency of state, and second is the institution of communities of them and us through politics of race. So this author argues that Butler's main concern is to incite her readers to consider alternative ways of thinking and doing, and that the parable of the sower seeks to read utopian vision at a time when utopia allegedly has been rendered impossible, not least by the two pathways mentioned above. So then there are some other comparisons made to other historical examples in this article. Choose to read this. The next is Failing Economies and Tortured Ecologies, Octavia Butler's Parable of the Sower and Parable of the Talents. So Parable of the Talents follows up. It's the second book to Parable of the Sower. So this is interesting, especially if you've read both. So, if you have time and you're so inclined, I encourage you to read Parable of the Talents. And the author in this article wants to underscore Butler's protagonist's desire for escape. So she examines the correlation between flight from urban social and ecological blights to toxicity in both of her texts as a diptych, which that's a piece of art that involves two pieces. So often we can look at it as, like something that's literally hinged together, folds open of two pieces, but in this case it's the two novels, Parable of the Sower and Parable of the Talents, and the failure of that flight to create any lasting positive change for the novel's characters. So she says that Lauren idealizes a kind of pastoral illusion, while her flight from south to north mirrors historical moves by African American individuals and communities seeking freedom and opportunity, nonetheless inverts the rural or pastoral to an urban shift made within those migrations. So the author then argues that while Sower appears to have a utopian conclusion, the second book, Talents, irrefutably shows it to be dystopian, a failure of misguided idealism. So this is also an interesting article, especially if you've read both the novels. And lastly, sorry about that. I had a little interruption. Let me get back to where we were. So lastly, the final excerpt I have is from the book Black Utopia, The History of an Idea from Black Nationalism to Afrofuturism. And the chapter title is Octavia Butler and the Politics of Utopian Transcendence. This is a little bit long, this chapter, but it brings up some interesting points about Lauren's attempt to reclaim an Afrocentric narrative of history, or I should say maybe Butler's through Lauren, bringing forth what Ralph Ellison called the boomerang, and to undo binaries of the modern and traditional, sacred and profane, high and low cultures. But less appreciated is that Parable was a work of political theory. So this article looks more closely at how the Parable is a rejection of neoliberal and Christian utopianism, and how it coexisted with the defense of Black democratic counterpoint serviceable for critique and resistance. This is the last set of questions for your discussion questions, so I'm not going to read over them, but I tried to come up with some overriding questions and throw in some other kind of ideas that I thought were interesting and worthwhile of discussion. So hopefully you'll read these over and you'll think about these in context to the book after you've completed reading the entire novel. And then I have some pages that I highlighted in these last sections of the novel to talk about. The first is on page 246, and after the earthquake, Butler is describing the chaos that's been created around the San Francisco, California Bay Area. And she talks about how rich are escaping by flying out in helicopters, and that how bridges like the Golden Gate Bridge in that area are being guarded by police or gangs. She says both groups are there to rob desperate fleeing people of their weapons, money, food, and water. At the least, the penalty for being too poor to be worth robbing is a beating, a rape, and or death. So I wanted to just highlight that and have you think about today. Do you think that is a realistic interpretation of what might happen in a future like Lauren's future, as far as the stigmatism and the treatment of people who are considered poor in our country? I have on page 259 marked the when Butler and her group gets to the San Luis Reservoir, there are several groups of people camping out there in what look like to Lauren temporary permanent structures, and they have gardens, and they seem to be kind of set up long term at this place. And this really just reminded me of camps that people set up during the Great Depression, especially as people migrated from the Bible Belt Midwest area, places like Arkansas and Oklahoma, to California. If you've read the Grapes of Wrath by John Steinbeck, that kind of comes to mind. So it was another, to me, interesting historical allusion. Well, maybe not an illusion, but a mirror kind of what happened during that time during the Great Depression, as many people migrated from the Midwest to the western states, specifically places like California, after farmland dried up in the Dust Bowl. I have also marked on page 261 this idea that I talked about in the last video too of Earthseed, where Lauren talks about she hopes to establish, in her words, a real heaven, not mythology or philosophy, a heaven that will be theirs to shape. So that would be the community members of Earthseed. And Bancoli replies, or hell, human beings are good at creating hells for themselves, even out of richness. So then they continue talking, and Lauren says, or Bancoli, I'm sorry, says, all religions change. Think about the big ones. What do you think Christ would be these days? A Baptist, a Methodist, a Catholic? And Buddha, do you think he'd be a Buddhist now? What kind of Buddhism would he practice? So his argument is that because God has changed, Earthseed will change. And he's asking Lauren about how she anticipates to meet these changes, which is an interesting and a very good question to think about as the group continues to move north in hopes of, at least for Lauren, establishing a community, an Earthseed community. On page 271, there's a reference to cannibalism by three boys and a girl, and the girl is very obviously pregnant. They are roasting a severed human leg. So I just wanted to, and there was another JSTOR article that I saw about this whole idea of cannibalism in Butler's collective works, which also mentions this example in Parable of the Sower. So to think about in terms of survival, in terms of what it means to be human, in terms of things like cannibalism. At what point do we draw the line? At what point is it okay or not? So there's a reference that these kids are probably scavengers, and they didn't necessarily kill anyone to eat them, but they're taking advantage of, possibly finding a dead body and then eating that body. So do you think that type of reality is feasible in the conditions that Butler has created in Parable of the Sower? And then on the bottom of page 277 and the top of page 278, Lauren talks about, she thinks that it might not be so bad a thing if most people had to endure all the pain they caused, in reference to her hyperempathy. So an about, do you think that if people actually physically felt the pain they inflicted on other people, that violence to other people would would be less. And this idea, I think that's important, is why is it you actually have to somebody else's pain to not want to inflict that pain upon them? So some interesting ideas to think about and discuss in that regard. On page 288, this carries on to page 289. There's a lot of discussion about, again, the company store, wages being paid as company script, not in cash, being forever in debt to an employer, which created a quasi-indentured people, even treating people as convicts because they are in debt, even though they've not committed any crime. They just can't get out of the debt of survival in this case, right? Of just actually living, of paying room and board, paying for their food, maybe medical bills. So to think about debt slaves who are even traded and sold, because in this case it talks about Emery and her sons paying from her after her husband died because she cannot pay her husband's debt. So there are a lot of references, not just to the company store, but also to slavery, specifically with the idea of people being traded, bought and sold, and in this case specifically children, due to debt. So this is a really important idea. Of course, it happened in our past, and it's something we absolutely want to prevent from ever happening again. But in Parable of the Sower, the conditions present, Butler makes a strong argument that something like this could in fact happen again. On page 305, there is mentioned, again, this idea of children being taken, stolen from their parents to pay it, and that the bosses, if you want to call them bosses, of these company stores are more like overseers. In slavery times, actually referred to have children who were hyper empathetic, like Lauren. And then on page 323, again, a reference to a slave driver or an overseer, when there's a suggestion perhaps Harry could get a job doing something like that, because Emery mentions that the whatever name we want to call them are often white. The drivers, she uses drivers specifically, which is a reference to slavery, are white men. So of course Harry is horrified by that idea, and then someone else makes a suggestion on the next page, 324, that perhaps he could work in a factory. And then Lauren says factories that use slave labor. So then there's a reference to the new president, President Donner, about jobs that were created up north for workers that, and this is from the book, workers are more throwaways than slaves. They breathe toxic fumes and drink contaminated water or get caught in unshielded machinery. They are easy to replace, thousands of jobless for every job. So border workers. And that just really stuck out to me, that description of them as border workers, because we do, of course, today have people who are called border workers working in unsafe and illegal. And the last part, just the last 2 pages of the book, Bancole is talking about not really understanding what we've lost. So in that context, what was lost? Why was that so important to Bancole, and what was it that Lauren didn't understand? And Bancole says that even though things are bad, we haven't hit on them yet. Starvation, disease, drug damage, and mob rule have only begun. Federal, state, and local governments still exist. Money is still good. He talks about when that is all gone, what is left, and how far can society sink. And then, of course, the book ends with, again, the naming the community acorn, and then a sower went out to sow his seed. So some fell by the wayside and whatnot that we've talked about in this parable. So just to think in terms of Acorn and the parable of the sower. How do we tie it all together? How do we tie contemporary issues, past issues, and relate those to parable, to think about really what message is Butler trying to convey to her readers in this book. It's had a resurgence in sales and readers lately. So think about maybe why. And ultimately, I hope you enjoyed this book.